Hi, Tyler. Just want to get your reaction to the DiJonai ejection and what you saw happen on that play.
In the moment, I thought that she made a play on the ball. I didn't think it warranted a flagrant two. I didn't see the replay, when it happened. So that was my initial thoughts. But the officials made what they made. I haven't looked at that play since, so I really don't know if it was justified or not. But that's what I thought in the moment.
I put together a little clip of DiJonai Carrington, who is definitely one of the dirtiest players in the WNBA.
Yeah, so Carrington is a dirty player, probably the dirtiest player in the league. And then she has the audacity to go online right after her ejection and claim that she got ejected because of racism.
And then Cunningham gets into the face of DiJonai Carrington.
DiJonai Carrington has been fired by the Chicago Sky, and the coach has had enough, and the basketball world is processing what happened as the institutional confirmation that the governance accountability pressure the Clark era's most consequential season has been building has now reached the specific organizational level that is closest to the competitive environment where the governance failures were most directly expressed, because the Chicago Sky's decision to fire Carrington in the aftermath of the assault on Sophie Cunningham and the WNBA's official ban is not simply the organizational consequence of a player whose conduct has made continued roster inclusion institutionally untenable. It is the organizational accountability statement that the franchise most directly responsible for the competitive environment in which Carrington's conduct was allowed to develop without the organizational deterrence that adequate internal player management should have produced has now formally accepted through the most severe organizational action available to it. The coach has had enough. The organization has fired the player. And the basketball world is now asking the governance accountability question that the franchise-level organizational response to the WNBA's official ban raises most urgently, which is whether the Chicago Sky's decision to fire Carrington represents the organizational accountability the governance accountability story requires at the franchise level, or whether the firing, necessary as it is as an organizational response to the most severe conduct violation in the Clark era's most dramatic season, leaves the organizational governance accountability questions the assault on Cunningham most specifically raises about how the Chicago Sky's internal organizational culture and player management allowed the conditions for Carrington's conduct to develop without adequate organizational deterrence formally unaddressed. Today I am breaking down exactly what the Chicago Sky's decision to fire Carrington means in the full institutional context of the governance accountability story the Clark era has built, why the coach's specific statement that they have had enough is the most analytically significant element of the firing announcement, and what it tells you about the organizational governance dimension of the Carrington situation that the WNBA's official ban alone does not address, what the franchise level organizational accountability the firing represents adds to the institutional governance transformation the accountability coalition's most comprehensive demands require, and what the entire sequence from the assault to the official ban to the franchise firing tells you about the most important governance accountability question the Clark era's most consequential governance season still needs to formally answer. And stay with me, because at the 10-minute mark I am going to show you the specific detail about the coach's enough statement that every outlet covering the firing has reported as the emotional conclusion of a dramatic organizational story, when it is actually the most institutionally revealing organizational communication the Chicago Sky has produced in the entire arc of the governance accountability situation, and the one that changes how the franchise-level organizational accountability dimension of the Carrington situation needs to be evaluated in its most complete institutional context. The Chicago Sky's organizational relationship with DiJonai Carrington in the context of the governance accountability story the Clark era has built is a relationship whose full institutional context the mainstream coverage of the firing has almost universally failed to provide. And that context is the essential foundation for understanding both what the firing represents as an organizational accountability action and what organizational governance questions it leaves formally unaddressed in the specific way the governance accountability coalition's most comprehensive demands most urgently require. Carrington was a member of the Chicago Sky's competitive roster throughout the period in which the physical conduct pattern the accountability story has been documenting developed without adequate institutional deterrence at both the league governance level and the franchise organizational level, and the specific organizational decisions the Chicago Sky made about Carrington's roster inclusion, player management, and internal organizational accountability during that period are the organizational governance questions that the firings issuance cannot retroactively answer, but that the complete organizational accountability the governance accountability story requires the franchise to formally engage with, rather than treating the firing as the organizational accounting for everything. The franchise's organizational governance contributed to the conditions the Carrington assault most severely expressed. The coach's statement that they have had enough is the organizational communication that most directly and most specifically addresses the emotional and institutional dimension of what the Carrington situation has meant for the organizational leadership most directly responsible for the competitive environment in which the conduct the assault expressed was developing, and the specific nature of what having enough means in the organizational governance context of everything the coach has been managing throughout the arc of the Clark era's most dramatic governance accountability season is the institutional detail that changes how the firing needs to be understood as both an organizational accountability action and an organizational governance revelation. Let us start with the coach's enough statement, because the specific language and the specific institutional content of what the organizational leadership responsible for the Chicago Sky's competitive environment has chosen to say in conjunction with the firing decision is the analytical foundation of everything that follows, and the mainstream coverage has been treating it primarily as the emotional punctuation of a dramatic organizational story without examining the specific institutional claims the enough statement makes about the organizational governance dimension of the Carrington situation and what those claims reveal about how the Chicago Sky's organizational leadership is processing its own institutional relationship with the governance accountability situation the firing is most formally addressing. The coach saying they have had enough is not simply an expression of personal frustration with a player whose conduct has created organizational problems. It is an institutional statement whose specific content reflects the coach's organizational assessment of the relationship between the individual conduct the firing addresses and the organizational governance situation the conduct most specifically expresses, and the specific content of that assessment is the detail that tells you the most about whether the Chicago Sky's organizational leadership understands the full scope of what the governance accountability story requires the franchise to formally account for, or whether the enough statement reflects a more limited organizational understanding of the firing is primarily the necessary organizational consequence of individual conduct that has exceeded what the organization can continue to accommodate. The distinction between those two organizational understandings of what having enough means in the context of the firing is the most important institutional distinction the enough statement contains. And reading the specific language of the coach's statement against the full institutional context of everything the governance accountability story has built toward the franchise-level organizational accountability dimension the firing most directly addresses is the analytical work that produces the most complete and the most institutionally honest account of what the Chicago Sky's firing of Carrington means as an organizational governance action and the most consequential governance accountability story women's basketball has ever produced. Now let us talk about what the firing means specifically as an organizational accountability action in the context of the WNBA's official ban that preceded it, because the relationship between the league-level governance response and the franchise-level organizational response is the institutional dynamic that the governance accountability story most specifically requires both to be adequate in their respective institutional domains and to be complementary in the way that makes the combined governance and organizational accountability for the Carrington situation more complete than either individual accountability action could be on its own. The WNBA's official ban addresses the league-level governance dimension of the accountability story by formally removing Carrington from the competitive ecosystem and by sending the strongest message in the league's institutional history about the individual conduct the ban most directly addresses. The Chicago Sky's firing addresses the franchise-level organizational dimension of the accountability story by formally removing Carrington from the organizational environment most directly responsible for the competitive conditions in which her conduct was developing, and by establishing the franchise's own organizational assessment of the conduct's incompatibility with the organizational standards the franchise is responsible for maintaining in its competitive environment. The complementarity between the league-level governance response and the franchise-level organizational response is the institutional dimension of the governance accountability situation that makes the combined accountability more complete than either individual action alone. And the specific way the coach's enough statement characterizes the franchise's organizational understanding of the relationship between the individual conduct and the organizational governance failures that created the conditions for it is the analytical key to evaluating whether the franchise-level organizational accountability the firing represents is adequately complementary to the league-level governance accountability the official ban has formally established. Now let us talk about what organizational governance questions the firing leaves formally unaddressed, because this is the analytically significant layer that the mainstream coverage is treating as the concluded dimension of an organizational accountability story rather than examining as the most important indicator of whether the franchise-level organizational accountability the firing represents is adequate to the full scope of what the Governance Accountability Coalition's most comprehensive demands require of every institutional level of the professional women's basketball ecosystem. The firing formally addresses the individual conduct dimension of the organizational accountability situation by removing the specific individual whose conduct most severely expressed the organizational governance failures the governance accountability story has been documenting at both the league and franchise levels. What the firing does not automatically address is the organizational governance dimension of the accountability situation, specifically the organizational decisions about player management, internal accountability, and competitive culture that the Chicago Sky made about Carrington's situation before the assault on Cunningham produced the most severe physical consequence the Clark-era's governance accountability story has generated. Those organizational governance decisions are the franchise-level equivalent of the league-level governance framework failures the Accountability Coalition has been most urgently demanding the WNBA formally acknowledge and address through the comprehensive governance framework reform we documented in the previous video covering the official ban. The Chicago Sky's organizational leadership formally accepting accountability for the organizational governance dimension of the Carrington situation, specifically the organizational decisions that created the conditions for the assault without adequate organizational deterrence, is the organizational governance accountability action that completes the franchise-level dimension of the accountability story in the same way that the WNBA's comprehensive governance framework reform completes the league-level dimension. The firing is the organizational equivalent of the official ban, the necessary organizational accountability action that formally addresses the individual conduct dimension without automatically constituting the organizational governance accountability that the complete franchise-level accountability story requires. Now let us zoom all the way out, because the Chicago Sky firing Carrington after the assault on Cunningham while the coach says they have had enough is not simply the organizational conclusion of an individual player's conduct situation. It is the franchise-level organizational accountability event that completes the most important institutional dimension of the governance accountability story that the official ban's league-level governance response cannot address, and the specific form of the organizational accountability the firing represents determines whether the franchise-level dimension of the governance accountability story has been adequately addressed or whether the organizational governance questions the assault most specifically raises about the Chicago Sky's internal organizational culture and player management remain formally unaddressed in the specific way the complete governance accountability transformation requires. The governance accountability story has been building across the Clark era's most dramatic season toward a complete institutional transformation that requires adequate accountability at every level of the professional women's basketball institutional ecosystem simultaneously. From the league governance level, where the official ban and the comprehensive governance framework reform address the most urgent governance accountability demands, to the franchise organizational level where the firing end. The organizational governance accountability that complements it address the most urgent organizational accountability demands to the individual level where the ban and the firing together address the most urgent individual accountability demands. The completeness of the institutional transformation requires all three levels of accountability to be adequate simultaneously rather than any single level's accountability being substituted for the others. And the specific way the Chicago Sky's firing of Carrington and the coach's enough statement together addressed the franchise-level organizational accountability dimension of the governance accountability story is the most important single indicator of whether the franchise-level accountability has been adequate to the complete transformation the Governance Accountability Coalition's most comprehensive demands require. Remember the detail about the coach's enough statement that every outlet is treating as emotional conclusion when it is actually the most institutionally revealing organizational communication? Here it is. The specific language of the enough statement, whatever its precise institutional content, reflects the coach's organizational assessment of how long the organizational leadership has been managing the tension between the organizational governance obligations the Carrington situation was creating and the competitive and organizational considerations that made the earlier organizational accountability actions the situation required easier to defer than to address, and that assessment is the most direct available indicator of whether the organizational leadership understands its own institutional responsibility for the organizational governance failures the assault on Cunningham most severely expressed, or whether the enough statement reflects a more limited organizational understanding of the firing as the necessary conclusion of an individual conduct situation rather than the beginning of the organizational governance accountability the complete institutional transformation requires. Here is what the mainstream coverage is almost entirely missing about the firing and the coach's enough statement and why together they matter beyond the immediate organizational drama of a franchise formally severing its relationship with the player whose conduct produced the most severe single physical consequence in the Clark era's governance accountability story. The specific organizational governance accountability questions the firing leaves formally unaddressed are the institutional dimension that has the most direct implications for how the governance accountability transformation the Clark era's most consequential season has been building toward can be complete at the franchise organizational level rather than simply at the league governance level where the official ban and the comprehensive governance framework reform are most directly addressing the most urgent governance accountability demands. Every franchise in the WNBA that is processing the Chicago Sky's firing of Carrington is simultaneously processing the organizational governance accountability questions the firing raises about how the Chicago Sky's internal organizational culture and player management allowed the conditions for the assault to develop without adequate organizational deterrence, and the franchise-level organizational governance accountability answers the Chicago Sky formally provides through the organizational communications that accompany and follow the firing are the most important institutional signals those franchises have for calibrating their own organizational governance accountability obligations in the competitive environment the Clark era's most dramatic governance accountability season has documented as requiring the most comprehensive institutional transformation in women's basketball governance history. The second hidden angle is the specific commercial implications of the firing for the Chicago Sky's commercial relationships and for the broader women's basketball commercial ecosystem whose commercial investments are organized around the governance integrity and competitive fairness standards the Accountability Coalition's most comprehensive demands have established as the minimum adequate institutional framework for the WNBA's most commercially significant era. My verdict on the Chicago Sky firing Carrington and the coach having enough is this, stated directly and completely. The Chicago Sky firing DiJonai Carrington after the assault on Sophie Cunningham while the coach says they have had enough is the necessary organizational accountability action that formally addresses the individual conduct dimension of the franchise-level organizational accountability story while simultaneously establishing the organizational governance accountability questions the firing leaves formally unaddressed as the most urgent remaining institutional challenge the complete franchise level accountability transformation requires the Chicago Sky's organizational leadership to formally engage with rather than treating the firing as the organizational accounting for everything the franchise's organizational governance contributed to the conditions the Carrington assault most severely expressed. The first reason this verdict is correct is the individual and organizational governance accountability distinction. The firing formally accepts individual conduct accountability for the most severe organizational conduct violation the Clark era has produced without automatically constituting the organizational governance accountability for the internal organizational culture and player management decisions that created the conditions for the violation. And the distinction between those two forms of organizational accountability is what the complete franchise-level accountability story most urgently requires. The organizational leadership's subsequent communications to formally address. The second reason is the coach's enough statement's institutional content. The specific language of the enough statement reflects the organizational leadership's assessment of its own institutional relationship with the governance accountability situation the firing most formally addresses, and reading that assessment against the full institutional context of the governance accountability story most accurately produces the evaluation of whether the franchise-level organizational accountability is adequate to the complete transformation or whether it leaves the organizational governance accountability questions the assault most specifically raises formally unaddressed. The third reason is the complementarity with the league governance response. The Chicago Sky's franchise-level organizational accountability needs to be complementary to the WNBA's league-level governance accountability in the specific way that makes the combined response to the Carrington situation more institutionally complete than either individual response alone. And the specific organizational governance accountability content of the firing and the coach's enough statement is the analytical key to evaluating whether that complementarity has been achieved or whether the franchise-level organizational accountability leaves the governance accountability story's most important institutional work formally incomplete at the organizational level. The strongest counter-argument is that the firing represents the most severe organizational accountability action available to the franchise, and that expecting organizational governance accountability that goes beyond the individual conduct accountability the firing most directly addresses sets an organizational accountability standard that no single organizational action could meet regardless of its severity and institutional significance. That argument has genuine merit as an organizational accountability proportionality concern. The counter to the counter is that the organizational governance accountability the governance accountability story most urgently requires is not disproportionate to the organizational governance failures the assault on Cunningham most severely expressed, but is specifically calibrated to the organizational governance accountability obligations the franchise's institutional relationship with the competitive environment in which the conduct developed creates, and the firing is the most severe organizational accountability action the franchise can take without necessarily being the most institutionally complete organizational accountability the governance accountability story requires the franchise to formally accept. So tell me in the comments right now, does the Chicago Sky's firing of Carrington and the coach's enough statement represent the complete franchise-level organizational accountability the governance accountability story requires, or does the organizational governance accountability the firing leaves formally unaddressed remain the most important institutional challenge the complete franchise-level accountability transformation has not yet formally produced? Drop your answer, because this is the organizational governance accountability question that determines whether the franchise-level dimension of the governance accountability story has been adequately addressed or whether the most important organizational governance accountability work remains ahead.